Uh, oh yeah. Okay, so we're getting close. Jumping in, we're going to talk about the second century church fathers. These were three men in the second century who had a profound impact through their writing and teachings on the early church and on us today. Their writings still influence how we think and what we do today. First of all is Ignatius, who was born around 50 AD. Tradition says that he was a disciple of the Apostle John. Given that John lived until 98, this is entirely possible. He would eventually be arrested, convicted, and sent to Rome for execution in 107 to 108. Church tradition says that Ignatius died in the Colosseum so that his death would be a spectacle for Romans and Christians alike. Some accounts place Ignatius' birth around 30 to 35 AD. Little is known of his life and his time as a bishop in Antioch. However, he must have been a man of great faith and character, given that he was the bishop of the church in Antioch, which is one of the oldest churches outside of Jerusalem. While on the way to Rome, Ignatius was visited by Christians. This gives credibility to the fact that Romans did not actively seek out Christians, as we said. They relied on accusations. While on his journey, it is recorded that Ignatius met with his friend Polycarp of Smyrna, whom he also wrote a letter to. He also wrote a letter to the bishop of Ephesus, Onesimus. It is possible that this is the same Onesimus that Paul addresses in his letter to Philemon. On the road to Rome, Ignatius writes a series of 7 letters to various churches. These are the letters to the Ephesians, the letters to the Magnesians, the letter to the Trallians, the letter to the Romans, the letter to the Philadelphians, and the letter to the Smyrnians, and lastly, the letter to Polycarp. Ignatius refers to himself in his letters as the bearer of God. This is most likely a title of honor given to him. However, it generated a rumor that he is actually the child whom Jesus put on his knee in Matthew 18, 1-6. They believe that the name was also meant to be borne by God or carried by God. So the whole idea is Jesus calls a young boy out from the crowd and puts him on his knee, and the disciple asks him, "Who will be the greatest in my king or in your kingdom?" And he makes the point that whosoever has a faith like this child will be the greatest in my kingdom. I'm paraphrasing, but that's effectively it. This was the tradition. There's no solid evidence to substantiate that, but that is the tradition. Ignatius, at some point on his journey, hears that some Christians are planning to break him out of prison and help him escape. He orders them not to do this, as he is ready to seal his witness with his blood. Though it is speculated this was also so that no one would question if he had denied the faith in Rome. His whole idea is if he was condemned to die and then appeared to be alive, then it would be speculated by Christians that Ignatius had denied the faith. He would rather die than be considered an apostate or a denier. In his letter to the Romans, he says, "I am God's wheat, and I am being ground by the teeth of the wild beasts, so that I may prove to be true bread." This was the whole idea that in martyrdom, the true quality of the Christian is tested, and whether or not they remain faithful determines whether or not they are truly Christians. We see here the beginnings of martyrdom being looked on as an honored calling and something to be prized. We'll be talking about that in the next couple slides. In his letters, Ignatius gives us a look into the issues of the day. Firstly, he defends the new position of the bishop. The bishop was a leadership position in the church that developed in the 2nd century as a source of authority in the post-apostolic age. He emphasizes that to go against the bishop is to place oneself outside of the church. This is a point that Ignatius stresses repeatedly. He highlighted the need for unity in the churches. We'll discuss this later. On the doctrine of Christ, Ignatius affirmed the dual natures of Christ, that he was truly human and truly God. He denounced the denial of Christ's humanity, which is docetism. He also denied adoptionism, which is the denial of Christ's divinity, or the idea that Christ became divine throughout his life. The next church father is Polycarp. Polycarp was the bishop of Smyrna. He was also referred to, or the same one that Ignatius mentions in his letter. This in Smyrna is what is now modern day Izmir in Turkey. This would be southern Turkey. Tradition says that he was the disciple of the apostle John, who personally ordained Polycarp as bishop. Like Ignatius, we know very little about Polycarp's early life, except that as a bishop, he was the teacher and mentor of another church father, Irenaeus of Lyon. We know for Polycarp that he traveled to Rome to join the discussion on when Easter should take place. This was a major discussion or debate in the early church. Some had a fixed date. Others wanted to favor the Jewish date of the Passover, and this would be debated hotly in the early church. Shortly after his journey, he would be arrested and martyred. The only formal letter we have that Polycarp wrote was a letter to the Philippians shortly after Ignatius's martyrdom. Polycarp wrote to the Philippians to ask if they had heard any details of his death. He also wrote to denounce heretics that would deny the humanity of Christ, and he finishes the letter with a message of hope to look forward to the resurrection when Christ returns. Unlike Ignatius, we have an account of Polycarp's death, possibly recorded by a Christian eyewitness to the event. It is believed that Polycarp's martyrdom took place in 155 in Smyrna. The policy of Trajan concerning Christians was still in effect. In an outburst of persecution, the pagan mob began calling for the bishop of Smyrna to be found and brought out. Polycarp, hearing of this, went into hiding. However, after moving several times and being discovered each time, he concluded that it was God's will that he be martyred and surrendered when he was next discovered. Due to his advanced age at this time, the judge urged him to recant his faith, worship the gods, and sacrifice to the emperor and curse Christ. When Polycarp refused, the judge ordered him to denounce Christianity by saying, "Out with the atheists." This is the whole idea that they believed Christianity, they denied the gods, therefore they were atheists. In response, Polycarp pointed to the pagan crowd and said, "Yes, out with the atheists." This obviously enraged them. Once again, the judge urged Polycarp to recant. Polycarp responded, "For 86 years I have served him, and he has done me no evil. How could I curse my king who saved me?" When threatened with being burned alive, Polycarp reportedly responded with, "You threaten me with fire that will burn for a moment and go out, but you are unaware of the eternal flame that will never go out," referencing hell. Before being put on the stake to be burned, Polycarp prayed and thanked God for the opportunity to take part in the cup of martyrdom, and that he would be appointed the honor of martyrdom. An important note is that Polycarp did not seek out martyrdom, but accepted it as it was given to him. It is also reported that a man named Quintus offered himself to be martyred alongside Polycarp. However, he failed and eventually denied Christ. It was believed that those who had been appointed to be martyrs by God would be strengthened by God to carry out their mission. However, those that willingly offered themselves up for martyrdom wrongfully assumed their role, and God would abandon them and allow them to fail. The last one is Irenaeus of Lyon, who was born in 130 in Asia Minor, likely in Smyrna. It is recorded that Irenaeus was an ardent admirer and reader of the writings of Polycarp. He would go on to be mentored by the bishop of Smyrna. At some point, Irenaeus would leave Asia Minor and take up a leadership role in the church at Lyon, in the province of Gaul, which is today Lyon in France. While away in Rome on church business, a wave of persecution broke out in Vienne and Lyon that would claim the life of the bishop Photinus. Upon his return, Irenaeus would be elected bishop of Lyon. He would serve as the bishop of Lyon until his death, likely by martyrdom in 202. However, this cannot be known for certain, as the earliest accounts of his martyrdom appear in the 5th or 6th century. In the first century, Irenaeus can be said, in the second century, Irenaeus can be said to be the church father with a truly pastoral heart. He showed no particular interest in philosophical debates or apologetic arguments, as the other church fathers did. Rather, Irenaeus focused on instructing his flock in how to be faithful followers of Jesus and on refuting heresy. Of Irenaeus' writings, only two have survived. The first is Demonstration of Apostolic Preaching, and the second is Against Heresies. In the former, he instructs his flocks on some points of apostolic doctrine, and in the latter, he writes against the Gnostic threat. In both of these, he does not look to add his own thoughts. Rather, he saw it as passing on the teachings of his teachers. Irenaeus ultimately saw himself as a shepherd, and also saw God as the shepherd above all shepherds, leading creation to its final goal. Irenaeus represents a transition figure between the apologists of the first century and the theologians of the second century, whereas apologists like Tatian and Justin Martyr, who Irenaeus did study, preferred to use philosophy to strengthen their arguments. Irenaeus believed too heavy a reliance on philosophy would lead to heresy. With the shift from apologetics to theology, the thinkers of the church would shift from external focused to internally focused. As we said before, the theologians of the third century would focus on correcting orthodoxy and correcting heresy. Correcting errant beliefs and developing orthodoxy. Well, so we're on the last slide. This is just I include this slide just as a wrap-up of tracking the church. How has it spread in this time, and what major theological issues take place in the second century? So by the end of the first century, the gospel had spread rapidly throughout the eastern Mediterranean, with strong churches in Judea, Samaria, Galilee, Syria, Asia Minor, Egypt, Greece, North Africa, Italy, the Middle East, and beyond. From the middle to the end of the second century, we see the church has developed even into the western half of the empire. This is evident from the fact that Irenaeus was the bishop of a thriving church in southern France, or what would become southern France, by the middle of the second century. There is also a belief that Paul went to and established a church in Spain. Before his death, as previously said, the earliest evidence we have of a church does not mean that it is the earliest it could have existed. So just because we don't have evidence of the gospel spreading to the western half of the empire does not mean it hadn't. Simply means that rather it's very likely that the gospel spread much farther in the first century, but the churches established were either too small or simply not recorded. This rapid spread of the gospel can be attributed to a near universal language of Greek and Latin. So the fact that Greek and Latin would be spoken by the majority of people in that time radically helped the spread of the gospel. Roman roads helped the spread of the gospel. Ease of transportation easily spread the gospel much quicker. The Pax Romana, which is the Roman peace, the idea that Rome ensured peace within its borders and had laws to back that up. Other areas on the fringes of the Roman Empire and beyond would take longer to be reached with the gospel. For example, the Upper Germanic tribes would not receive the gospel until the 4th or 5th century. Ultimately, the spreading of the gospel would be a matter of great importance in the church. As I said in the first series, the spread of the gospel was largely carried out by merchants, traders, slaves, even soldiers who were traveling to other areas of the empire. We like to think that missionary efforts drove the gospel. While they may have brought it to the more remote areas of the empire, everyday Christians did the legwork of spreading the gospel throughout the Roman Empire and beyond. For a major theological development, we have apostles, bishops, deacons, and presbyters. These four. So, as I said previously, the four main pillars of authority in the first century were gone by the second. These four pillars were the testimony of the apostles. By the first century, they had all died out. The second would be the brothers of Jesus, namely James, who was the leader of the church in Jerusalem, and Jude, both of whom wrote the books of the Bible, namely James and Jude. The third would be those who personally knew Jesus as he was on earth. In the first century, there would have been many people, even by the end, who would have physically seen Jesus, who could give or maybe not authoritative, but an account of what Jesus had taught. By the end of the first century, most of them, if not all of them, were dead. Fourthly, Jerusalem itself was all but gone. In the first revolt, the city suffered a great deal of damage by the Romans, and by the second Jewish revolt, the city was completely destroyed. And so you have four major sources of authority that, if you were a new convert, you could go to these places and you could ask questions regarding how to live, what practices should we have, what is true doctrine. You could go to them. These are gone. And so the church now has to answer the question, who has the authority to speak authoritatively now that all of these sources are gone? These had disappeared. This left a vacuum of authority that needed to be filled, and the bishops would be the answer. This would eventually lead to the development of the role of the bishop. The major theological issue of the second century would center on authority. Who has the authority to dictate orthodoxy, to determine scripture, to deal judgment, and so forth? The major heretical and heterodox groups would each put forward their own claim over authority. In the end, the church would develop the position of bishop to be the voice of authority in their churches and eventually cities. In the first century, there did exist in each church a body of elders or presbyters and another group of called deacons. The presbyters would oversee the running of the church, teaching and worship and discipline, and the deacons would assist in these things, except in distributing the Lord's Supper. By the time of Ignatius, around 150, this structure had shifted slightly. By the middle of the second century, the church hierarchy was a single bishop, a group of presbyters, and a group of deacons. The acceptance of this form of church government would be slowly accepted by all churches. However, the powers and responsibilities of the bishops, presbyters, and deacons would vary by regions and cities. The role of the bishop would be strengthened by the concept of apostolic succession, which was developed in response to Gnostics claiming they had the secret teachings of Jesus. The early church countered this by showing that they had an unbroken chain of leadership back to the apostles, stating that this connection ensured the correct teaching. In the early church, the role of the bishop was distinct in four ways. Firstly, the office of the bishop was distinct by being the direct successors of the apostle. Secondly, the bishop would exercise authority over jurisdictional regions. Thirdly, the only valid ordainment of bishops could take place by the laying of hands of other bishops. Meaning, you couldn't simply decide that you were a bishop. You had to be ordained by other bishops. Fourthly, without apostolic succession, there is no valid bishop, meaning there is no valid ministry, sacraments, or communion. This was a big deal because it effectively meant that you are not a church if you don't have a valid bishop. Lastly, the role of the bishop and apostolic succession would take root in the church, and many churches outside of Protestantism still maintain the need for an ordained bishop with a traceable lineage back to the apostles. The Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches both place great store in apostolic succession. Among Protestants, the Anglicans, Moravians, Hussites, and some Lutherans advocate for apostolic succession. Whether or not we affirm the role of the bishop and apostolic succession, we can see the need for such foundation in the early church to answer the issues of the day. So we can recognize that the early church developed this position not as a means of dividing the church, but as unifying the church. Their goal was not to say you're a church and we are not, but rather to counter the Gnostic threat effectively say that we can say that we are teaching the true teachings of Jesus Christ and that they are not. That was the entire idea. The next major issue is the primacy of Rome and the Pope. With the developing role of the bishop, it was perhaps inevitable that the bishops of powerful historical and important cities would rise higher than others. This can be seen especially when a single bishop would take authority over an entire city and command those churches in that city. If a single bishop can have authority over a whole city, then surely the Bishop of Rome should have authority over all churches in the empire. I'm playing out more the logic of probably where their minds went of if if the Rome is the city above all cities, then the Bishop of Rome must be the bishop above all bishops. Is kind of the idea. This is very likely to be the line of thought that caused the Bishop of Rome to begin weighing in on matters outside of his jurisdiction. It is important to note that that contrary to Roman Catholic claims, the Bishop of Rome, or the Pope, as we would call, or he would come to be known, was not apostolically ordained role. Rather, the concept of the supremacy of Rome and the papacy. The papacy is the high, like the is the name given to the Pope and his office. And the powers that the Pope now enjoys would develop over the next 2,000 years. In the early church, the Bishop of Rome would attempt to assert himself and would often be met with mockery from other bishops and church fathers. I believe would be Tertullian in the 3rd century, where the bishop would try to take command over other bishops, I think he started wearing he started to see himself in a higher light, and Tertullian, for whatever reason, refers to him as Pontifex Maximus, Pontifex Maximus, which is the pagan high priest, effectively saying you're acting like a pagan, and it was a means of calling him down. Eventually, in the 4th century, Constantinople would also be elevated to rival Rome in authority, especially with the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century. This would cause tension between the Eastern and Western churches that still exist to this day. To this day, Eastern Orthodox Church would view the Pope as nothing more than a bishop over an important city, but as a single bishop over that city. And this would be a primary reason that would end in around 1000 AD, where the Eastern and Western churches would officially split. This would be a major point of contention. The Eastern Orthodox do not recognize the supremacy of the Pope of Rome. They do not recognize the authority of the Pope over all Christian churches, as he would say. But this would be something like, this is where we first see it. Eventually, this would develop more and more, especially after the fall of Rome. The Pope would claim more and more power for himself as the years go on. The last point we're going to talk about is martyrdom. In the 2nd century, it was believed that those who were martyred had been appointed to that position by God. The role of the martyr would continue to be elevated and given special honor. As previously mentioned, the concept of being appointed to be martyred by God had been, to be martyred, or the concept of being appointed to be martyred by God had already begun, at the very least, by the beginning of the 2nd century. The belief followed 2 biblical passages, Matthew 10:33 and Matthew 10:19 and 20. Matthew 10:33 says that those who deny Christ before man, Christ will deny him before the Father. This was the whole idea that I'll just keep going. And then Matthew 10:19 or 10:19 to 20 is where Jesus is saying that if you are brought before magistrates and judges, that I will give you the words to say. The first stating that those who deny Jesus would be denied by Jesus before God. Therefore, it followed that to endure to death without denying Jesus would ensure salvation for the martyr, basically saying that if you died by martyrdom, it guaranteed your salvation. The second passage is a promise from Jesus that those who find themselves on trial for Christianity will receive the words to say by the Holy Spirit. The role of a martyr would be the highest honor a Christian could be called to in this life. For this reason, it was assumed that all the apostles also died by martyrdom. whether this was factual or not, with the exception of the Apostle John. So, for the church tradition tells us that most, if not all, of the apostles died violent deaths by martyrdom. We don't, besides Peter and Paul, we don't know this for factual history. It is possible they could have, but it's also possible that these may be embellished in the 2nd century, because if you as a martyr, you could aspire, like, if you were martyred, and this is the highest calling you can have in this life, therefore you couldn't have a higher calling than the apostles of Jesus Christ. Therefore, they must have all died by martyrdom. Carrying on, many of these witnesses would be killed and some would not be. Rather, many would be tortured and then released. Whichever the case, whether a martyr was tortured and released or killed, just give me a second. Whatever the case, these Christians would be called confessors and would be seen as near prophets. Other Christians would approach them with reverence and awe, asking questions regarding their own sins. Eventually, these confessors and their deaths would be mythologized, embellished, and retold to encourage the church. The date of a martyr's death would be also celebrated by the churches. They would visit the martyr's tomb, adorn it with relics of that martyr, as they believed that these martyrs had a special position with God and would advocate for them. And so the concept of veneration of saints and martyrs began, a belief that is still strong in the Catholic and Orthodox churches today, to this day. So much so that to touch the body of a martyr or a saint of the church is seen to be giving you grace. To the point where I've talked to missionaries where we talk about the Eastern or the Orthodox Ukrainian church. Many saints will actually have a hole in their coffin that you can go to. You can put your hand, as disgusting as this is, into that coffin and touch the body of the saint, believing it takes upon you some degree of grace that saint had incurred in his life. There is a whole system of the view of grace in the Catholic and Orthodox Church is very different from ours. There's a whole system. At some point, we can talk about it. It's, oh Lord, it'd be kind of, yeah. It's very strange when you, from a Protestant point of view, and it would. Here we see very, very primitive versions of it. This would continue to spread throughout the centuries. And moving on. If this continues, we'll discuss that in a later series. When we discuss the acceptance of the role of bishops, the development of the primacy of Rome, and more importantly, the extreme views of martyrdom, it is important to remember that what we discussed regarding the writings of the Church Fathers. Just because a practice is popular in a certain area does not imply that practice has been accepted everywhere. Just because the veneration of martyrs has appeared in the 2nd century does not mean the whole church has accepted it. It would be similar today if someone said that the whole church in North America has accepted queer theology and becoming alphabet allies because some churches have accepted it. That would be the whole idea. If a historian were to look back 200 years ago and say, well, this church is practicing this, therefore the entire church is practicing this, that's not accurate. That's not true. That's not to say every church in that one church is even doing this, but rather say that some Christians have begun doing this, and it would be a tradition that would continue on in the church. That is the end of the 2nd century. This ends our series on the 2nd century. While this century does not have the distinct end the 1st century did with the death of John the Apostle, the end of the 2nd century sees the church becoming more established in their church practices, hierarchy, and responsibilities. As already said, the apologists of the 2nd century would become the theologians of the 3rd century. The church fathers in these next few centuries would focus on theological development, crafting the foundations of the theological ideas that we still hold. In the 2nd century, many heresies appeared and were confronted by the church fathers. However, the church did not have the power to end their heresy. Rather, the Gnostics, Ebionites, and other heretical sects would continue to be a problem in the 3rd century, and new heresies would be born.